How's it going, everyone? Thanks for tuning into this episode of Find Your Cause. Today we have Patty Capuch and Vince Hennigan, who are the Executive Director and Director of Operations at Impact Behavioral Health Partners. Patty and Vince, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
All right. So, per usual, we like to start our interviews with just the mission of the organizations that we're interviewing. So, this could go to either one of you. What is the mission of Impact?
Well, our mission is to develop and champion opportunities for people with mental illness by providing housing, employment, and clinical support so that each person can live as independently as possible.
All right. And we'll get into that and all the programming you've built around it. But before we do, why y'all? Why is Impact an organization that you're, dedicating your at least 40 hours a week towards?
Well, I'll start if that's okay. I have sort of two things that I think brought me here. One, when I went to grad school and started what my career, I thought I was going to be a social worker for kids with cancer. That's what I wanted to do. And my first year internship was actually in an AIDS organization, and I ended up working with women and children with HIV and AIDS. And I saw firsthand really about how people with AIDS and children with AIDS were treated in society. And then my next year, I did an internship at a cancer center, and I saw a completely different way. If somebody had HIV, the neighborhood didn't come rallying around them with casseroles and helping out, right? But if somebody got diagnosed with cancer, it was a completely different story. And I think it felt, for me, it sort of changed how I felt about who I wanted to work with, and really kind of those that were stigmatized and on the margins. And I think mental health folks who have a mental illness are still facing that stigma. So that sort of started me on that path. And then number two, my own family, due to a tornado when I was a kid, we were homeless for about 4 months. And so I think that that's something that connects me to the mission of this organization in terms of the housing part. So I think it was that, but also really wanting to work with folks who didn't seem to have a voice I've done that my whole career. And that's what led me here.
Thank you for that. And Vince, how about yourself?
So mine, I have an interesting background. I actually was a carpenter for many years and ran a construction company along with my father. And never realized I would go into the mental health field. Ended up going back to school while working carpentry, got a degree in psychology, and but still went back to construction, right? And then my father fell down and had a brain injury, and he spent about 9 months in a coma. And then severe traumatic brain injury that continued to cause him to need full-time care after he got out of the coma. We had to close down the construction company. I became his caregiver and then went back to get a master's degree in mental health because at that point I was in a very mental health focused state of my life. And, as a result of his injury, he got really close to homelessness, had his house foreclosed on. My mom and him ended up, through the generosity of others, were able to find housing and did not become homeless. But, I got to see firsthand, I myself went without an income for a long period of time, got right up against the cusp of homelessness, if not for a little bit of luck, right? And I think I see... When I got my degree, I started looking at places that I could work. And the very first place I applied to after I got my master's degree was Impact. At that point, we were called Housing Options. And I started off as a clinician. And it's because I saw in this population that we work with, I saw myself, I saw my family, I saw my brother, I saw my sister, I saw my relatives that have had this. But the difference was we had a little bit stronger safety net or a little bit more luck. And so I started really seeing like this was a population I wanted to work with and really help because I built housing for people who are usually had plenty of money for a very long time. And now I get to take those same skills and apply that towards helping the people who need it the most. And I think that is probably the best thing I've ever had as far as a job goes. So,
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for that background as well. So impact in general. We went over the mission, and thank you both for sharing the reasons why y'all are here. It's really inspiring, and it sounds like you all are connected to it at a much deeper level from your backgrounds, just
Yeah.
alone. So, what has been the kind of the history of the programming at Impact? What were some of the initial It sounds like it used to be a different name, but it sounds like housing was the initial focus. I'd love to hear about some of the initial programming that started that to be the focus of the organization during inception.
Okay, well, I'll start and then Vince can add. Impact was founded in 1988, and it was at a time when mental institutions were closing down, and our founders really wanted folks that were coming out of those institutions to come back to their communities and have safe and affordable and really decent places to live. And so they spent a lot of time convincing neighbors and community members that that they should welcome folks coming back into the community. And so through that, our first building was purchased, Vince,
In
in
1991.
1991, and then so we went from that, and then adding clinical services. At that time, our name was Housing Options for the Mentally Ill Incorporated in Evanston. Um, we did change the name in 2017 just because it made more sense because we were doing more services. We changed to Impact Behavioral Health Partners because we have clinical and we added employment services after. But we started with that one building and that one reason. But that's been the core really about really providing that safe housing for folks with mental illness. And
Yeah.
that's been pervasive throughout.
Yeah, and I think we've expanded our program from just being a housing provider, right? And we used to contract out getting the clinical services through other agencies. Then we started branching out and building our clinical services, and then we started doing our employment services. So the big three branches that we provide are housing, which is actually in some ways our smallest program because it's the fewest people served because you only have so many bedrooms, right?
Right.
Our clinical services, which has grown impressively over the last few years, and our employment services, which is one of the top individualized placement and support program, the IPS model. That's what that stands for, and it's one of the top ones in the not just the state but the entire nation.
It's amazing to see how the expansion of the programming, understanding the reason why Impact was needed to be created. This is back in 1988, so I'm not sure if y'all were a part of the organization then, but just the housing needs in general. What have been some of, in your opinions, the causes of some of these housing challenges that are being faced in your area? I'd love to kind of go from the beginning, whether it's somebody that's just like you said, wrong place, wrong time, or you got a little lucky, so you're just on the cusp of being homeless versus not. What have you seen as some of the causes with the people that you guys are serving of homelessness?
I think,
I'm going to
yeah.
let you take that.
So,
yeah.
It really starts with the explosion of homelessness that started in the 1980s. So the reason why we were founded in 1988 is if you look back at the history of homelessness, it wasn't really a thing in the 70s and 60s in the United States. Affordable housing and things like, the YMCA, those are still in existence, but they were more prevalent then. There was um, there were better, safety nets in place that prevented people from ever getting to the point where they truly were homeless. Then we saw this explosion in the 80s. It's well documented. It continued, it kind of plateaued for a little bit in the 90s. And then again in the 2000s, it started going up again. And we started seeing this just model of where a lot of people are becoming homeless because they're not, it starts with the mental health facilities being shut down because in many of the cases they were atrocious conditions that people were being lived in, and then just an absence of affordable housing. You hear about this. It's not just in our area; it's in all areas. I have family in Ireland, and they talk about their housing crisis. They have homelessness shooting way up. It's to avoid any type of political perspective
Yeah,
on
yeah,
it.
yeah.
It's just an absence of housing,
Yep.
especially after the housing bubble in 2008. You actually saw a decrease in construction for the first 4 years, which has caused a glut in the market. A lot of people ended up, I look at my neighborhood, instead of new housing being built that's smaller, they're taking smaller starter homes, chopping off the top and adding second stories. I'm sure everyone who lives in any part of Chicago has seen this happening in their neighborhood. And what you're seeing then is smaller housing is going away, bigger housing. We had the whole McMansion thing. You have corporate ownership of these apartment buildings so that they're being motivated by the profit model, which is understandable, but it just means that as prices go up, you're going to see fewer affordable housing options, especially for the people who are in the greatest need. And we work with people who are at, it's called 30% AMI or 15% AMI. AMI is area median income. So we're working with people who are making the least amount of money because of their disabilities. They're unable to work, or at least unable to work full time. There just isn't housing for them. Yeah, like try
Yeah.
finding an apartment at the affordability level of someone who's making $900 a month.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Awesome. Well, thanks for that quick history lesson. And like you said, it's well documented as well. So housing and then expanding to additional programming that you do. What drove the need to in-house and kind of vertically integrate those programmings to expand beyond housing? Was it just trying to keep everything in one location to make it easiest for the people going through the programs, or what kind of drove that expansion?
I think from the housing perspective, right? Because we are a little bit unique in that we're a mental health agency that also does its own property management. And it's because we approach it with a trauma informed property management style. You know, the person who's in charge of housing me is someone who has LPC and has worked as a clinician so that we can approach things in a way that's trauma informed. We utilize techniques like motivational interviewing and solutions focused therapy to try and help people maintain the stability of their housing, but in a way that isn't as combative. You know, it isn't just you have a lease violation, fix the lease violation. It's like, how do we work together to solve this problem? And by using harm reduction approaches. So I use an example of sometimes you'll have people who get angry and they have outbursts and they punch holes in their wall, especially drywall. It's really easy to get through drywall. Um, and for some people, that's a satisfying crunch as their fist goes through it. It helps them relieve that tension. So a solution we might come up with is putting drywall on a bookshelf and having them punch through the drywall that's in the bookshelf rather than destroying their apartment. And that way you're letting them get their need met that they have for this, you know, punching through a hole in a wall while also getting their need met of not destroying their apartment in the process.
And
Right.
I think for us, we're permanent supportive housing. And so when Vince was saying that if you look at the numbers of people that we have served, and we can talk about the growth in just a minute, but because we're permanent, we don't want those numbers fluctuating, right? Unless we build a new building or are able to add more units, we really try very hard to keep people in their homes. And I think it's the housing team working with the clinicians together that they come up with that. And so we're not siloed, right? So that where
Yeah.
Vince is talking about that property management piece and coming from that trauma informed place, the housing folks are able to identify things that are happening and say, hey, to the therapist or to the case manager, we need to come together and work on a solution to keep somebody housed. Because the housing first model, it really, I think, Vince has been trained by a person who really started that. But for us, we really want people to stay housed, right? That is our goal. We don't want to return people into homelessness. That's where a lot of our referrals come from. So it's that sort of wraparound.
Yeah.
And then adding in, if somebody wants a job, we will work with them and refer them to the employment program, and
Wow.
so they can have that complement of services.
Yeah. And how do y'all define? Because trauma informed is a terminology that I hear in a decent amount of interviews. And when I think trauma informed, I just think like coming from a place of more empathy. But how do y'all what's the definition of trauma informed? I'm sure there's a whole program or certification process to be able to have that designation.
It's so the term just means that you're recognizing that behaviors are a response to traumatic events. So to give an example, when you see that someone, and I like your use of the word empathy to describe it too, because it is trying to understand the perspective of the individual that's behaving. So we have, the stereotypical Karen behaviors, right, that's going around now. So that's usually something that someone learned was an effective strategy to get their needs met, probably in a traumatic environment
Mm.
where the only way you could be heard is if you raised your voice or if you screamed from the mountaintops, right? And knowing that if someone's been homeless, right, they may have a deep insecurity about where their food is and where their food might come from. And they may feel very protective of their food. So you might see what is called food hoarding pretty often. And recognizing that this is a product of the traumas this person's experienced. It's not them having a problem. It's asking yourself, instead of asking what's wrong with a person, you ask what happened to a person so that you can gain a better understanding of why they developed this behavior model that they have to interact with the world and to get their needs met.
Yep. Yep. That's great. That's a great, yeah. Not what's wrong with you, what happened to you. Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, amazing. So the addition of these new programs for job development and the clinical being added in house, how has that expanded the reach that you've been able to have? I'd love to hear about some of the numbers. I know that you started with one physical building and now you have many more. I'd like to hear that growth. And then I'm sure you started with a handful of folks and now it's grown to the impact of many. So I'd love to hear some of the actual data points from your growth over the years.
Great. Well, I'll have Vince talk about the buildings, and then I'll talk about the numbers and the employment program a bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had for the first 16 years that we existed, essentially, we acquired 6 total buildings with 24 units. Um, and then while we were expanding to provide the clinical services in house and employment services in house, we didn't expand our housing program that significantly. But in the past 3 years, we've acquired 3 more buildings, but
Wow.
23 total units in those 3 buildings, including a new construction building, ground up construction of 16 state of the art green building codes, I think LEED certified
Yep. Yep.
building. We're also converting one of buildings that we're operating to zero net emissions as a result of trying to incorporate green policies because climate change affects the poorest people in the world the most.
Right.
So making sure that when we're building housing for people who are lower income, we're building it in a way that's sustainable in the long term. And I think we went from the very first building could house 10 people to now we have the capacity to house over 100 in our own
Jeez.
programs. And then because of the expansion of our clinical and employment services, which Patty's going to talk about, that's just a drop in the bucket on the people that we serve.
Yeah, and I'll also say with the new, the new construction and another building that a foundation purchased for us that gave us some time to purchase back and pay them back. Those were 1 bedrooms, and so we've been able to move folks who've been in our room. In all of our buildings were 2 and 3 bedroom units, so we had roommates. So we're able to move those in roommate situations into these 1 bedrooms, and now we've been housing families, and we've been
Mm.
I think we have 8 families,
6
7 families.
families, the capacity for 8.
Of
2 more are
capacity
going to
for
be
8.
moving in soon.
Yes, and so it'd be we get those referrals primarily from the school, Evanston school system social worker, for those folks that she knows who are at risk of homelessness or who may be couch surfing, or we had one who they were living in their van in a parking
Mm-hmm.
lot. And so now we're doing that same permanent supportive housing model with families. And that's something that the founders really wanted to do, but they really, in purchasing and building a building, it's all so expensive that it takes a long time to do that. But I'm really happy that we're finally able to do that. And then with the clinical that we added with that and employment, our director of participant services, Chris Knoper and Vince, initially got the idea to provide these employment services to other behavioral health organizations, and get the referrals for folks who might want to have jobs. And so we started with one, Leiden Family Services, that was our first partner. And then we just kept going and improving that model, providing those services for free. And then we would get the referrals for folks who wanted to work. And the criteria was they had to have a mental health diagnosis. And we had what's called zero exclusion, meaning that it didn't matter what their diagnosis was, that we were going to work with them to get a job. And I think what's been so successful for us is that we want people that work at Impact to be happy working at Impact, and we want people who are getting jobs to be happy. So we really try, it's very individualized. Like if you've had a job before, what worked? And what did you like about it? Or if it didn't work, what didn't you like? Or, and we stay with someone even after they've gotten a job as long as they need us. And we've been able to grow that program. And that's really been where the biggest growth in our number of participants we serve. We started working with federally qualified health centers, including Erie Family Health, PCC Wellness out of the Austin neighborhood, Howard Brown Health, and we have grown. So when I started in 2018, we were serving around 200 participants. We just finished the fiscal year for, June 30th was our fiscal year close, and we served over 1,100 participants.
Hmm.
And last year we served 700. So the primary growth of from last year 700 to this year 1,100 has been in that employment program. We've also taken the
Wow.
clinical model, though, and done something very similar with the partners. So, for example, the federally qualified health centers, where a lot of low income folks go to get their primary care, they might get some psychiatric meds from the primary care physician, and they may be connected to behavioral health, but because they see so many folks, like thousands and thousands of patients, they don't have time to do real in-depth therapy. So they might
Hmm.
do like a 2-3 month therapy, and then they can refer them to us to then really do the kind of work that some folks need. And some of the populations that they work with are very resistant to therapy. They wouldn't just come to a therapist right from the start, but if they can come in through employment, get to know us, and then we can refer them to therapy. So we've been able to really grow our program that way as well.
And kind of a growth of our clinical slash housing model. So it's not our housing that we own, but we've partnered with the Housing Authority of Cook County to provide mental health and housing stability services in their housing authority owned buildings in the northern suburbs, which has added over 700 people that we can provide services to. But
Wow.
of that, we've provided services in the last fiscal year. I just checked it this morning. 363 people received
Jeez.
services from us, or sorry, 352 people. That's for 363 was when I added in something else.
Yeah.
But that was the number of people who received our clinical mental health services in their homes and in the buildings that they're living in, which is another big part of our model, is that
Yep.
reducing the barriers to getting the services.
Yep.
And for some people, that is trying to find it, getting into a new location. So,
Yeah, and I'll just chime in with that. The Housing Authority grant, that was the first in the nation where they brought behavioral health care to the tenants in their buildings. And the
Mm.
goal was to keep people housed and to try to link people to care that wouldn't normally do that. And it's a variety of populations. Still, with our mission, everyone has to have a mental health diagnosis, but there are folks who are Polish speaking or Russian speaking, or there are a lot of older senior citizens who didn't might not know how to fill out forms, and or might not know how to fill out a form for transportation or something like that. And we've been able to do that, and in providing those concrete services, get to know them where they're like, okay, they want to talk about a few more things, and primarily an overarching goal, keeping them housed and try to keep them from homelessness.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That's so interesting, kind of the intersection of housing and these clinical mental health services. Do you know if there's any data published yet about how retention or the difference between housing and maintaining housing with these services versus people being able to stay housed without these services being provided? Is there like an ability to see the difference, to show the impact of like, wow, providing this job employment services in addition to the clinical health services increases the likelihood of them staying in the house by like 50% or 100%? I'm wondering if that's been compared yet, because
Well,
I'm sure there's a difference.
the supportive housing model is what that really is, and with a little bit added, with the IPS model being added into it, is
Yeah.
kind of what we're doing. I don't know if there's a whole lot. We've been part of studies on how the IPS model has helped people in other realms like Social
Yeah.
Security Administration and things like
Mm.
that have helped fund studies. We're still looking for opportunities to fund studies on how it affects housing.
Yep. Yep.
But supportive services being attached to housing there's lots of data on HUD's website that shows that this is what helps stabilize placements,
Yep.
and that the housing first model is more effective than not using it, because if you set a bunch of preconditions to getting housing that people have to jump through those hoops in order to get it,
Yep.
they're not going to succeed as much as if they had, if you let them have a stable base of operations
Yep.
first, then they can do it. Even holding down a job, if you don't have a steady
Yeah.
address, it's very hard. It's if you. I was just listening to a sports radio show today, and they were talking about one of the people who works in the building getting ready in the bathroom. And my first thought was that person's homeless and they're trying to maintain their job, and they're getting told on by these coworkers for using the bathroom inappropriately when that's the only way
Wow.
that they can survive and get that. So
Not
he's at
trauma
risk of losing
informed.
his job. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
expect sports radio to be very trauma
Yeah.
informed.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. 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 That's amazing. The future, y'all have in the past 3 years alone, it sounds like added those three buildings and a lot more actual housing options. I'm sure the clinical is expanding and the job as well as the job employment is expanding. What are your hopes for the next 3 years and beyond?
Yeah, I know we're just embarking on a new strategic planning process. So we hit all of the goals that we set for ourselves in the previous plan, but it's a good year. We'll be we have an announcement that we can't say today, but we
Yeah.
will.
Yeah.
We have a major employment announcement that we'll be talking about soon. But we want to build more housing. That's the thing. We want to
Yep.
expand our family program. We'd like to not have roommates if possible. We'd like, that going back to our mission about people living as independently as possible, people can do it. And I think there's been preconceived notions about people with mental illness, even severe mental illness, that can't live on their own, can't hold down a job. We're here to say that is absolutely not true. Certainly there are cases where people can't, but the majority of our participants are able to, they're just in their communities. Our buildings are in communities where folks don't even know our buildings are there, which is how we want it, because we just want our participants to be part of the fabric of the communities they are. And we really just want to give them the tools to be able to just live their lives, and whatever their goals are, we're going to help them get there. And so for us, it's acquiring more buildings so that we can increase that, because I think that's one thing where I feel very proud that we're very good in all of our program areas. I think though, the permanent part of, we really understand housing first. We get referred um, the hardest to house. They'll send folks to us that will say they haven't been successful at a few other organizations, but we
Mm.
feel like they'll be successful with you. And even if they're only housed 2-3 years with us, right, and they need a higher level of care than what we can provide because we are not on site, they really do live independently. That's still a win
Hmm.
to have somebody not be living on the street, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something. When we look at where we're going to go, we're going to continue to build more buildings or acquire more buildings. We want to house more families. We want to grow our clinical program along with that and offer our services to more people, and with our employment services too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
I think stressing that part that you were talking about with, reframing how we see success, I think is an important thing. So if they've lived in the woods for 15 years and they spend 1 year housed, that's a big success. That's a big change in their life outcomes. Even if they don't manage, part of being permanent and part of working with people is allowing them to learn the process. And we don't learn the process from our successes. We learn the processes from our failures. We learn from when we make mistakes. And working with people and giving them that autonomy to make some mistakes along the process makes it a little bit harder to work with, the people that we work with, but it's more rewarding and it's more long term. The
Yep.
benefits last longer.
Yeah. Wow. So for people that are listening and inspired and want to get engaged, what type of engagement do you look for, and how can they get engaged?
Well, I think, for us, we don't utilize a lot of volunteers. I think that we're different than some organizations. Our participants are pretty, they're not that they're not necessarily open to having volunteers be a part of it, but that it's not something we've utilized very much. So I think for
Mm-hmm.
us, it generally is like donations around. One of the big things for our employment folks is they don't have the right clothes to wear to interviews and things like that, because they're going for all kinds of jobs. They're going for professional jobs where they need to dress up, and we don't really have, there's no funding for something like that. There's no funding for transportation for them to get to and from. So we look for donations that we can use to help them purchase clothes or get to their appointments. So that's one of the one of the biggest things I think for us is donations around that.
And then where could they find you? What's the best way to get in contact? Impact your website?
Impactbehavioral.org. Yeah. And then
Yep.
we have all of our services listed there. And we have a development department that if you got in touch with them, they'd be able to say, here's what we need, around the holidays. Since we just started with families, we like to fundraise to be able to, we have 18 kids in the program. So we want to try to make sure we've always provided like a food box or something, or a food card for our participants. But as we've grown, that's really hard to do. When we first started and it was only say 70 or 80 in our housing program, that was a lot easier to do. So I think just trying to do extra for our participants that they
Yep.
don't normally get, and that's where folks come in. Any donation helps. So
Yeah, and if you go to that website again, it's impactbehavioral.org. There's a how to help link on there as well that our development people were smart enough to put on there.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, we'll make sure to share that in the show notes then, and also the social media links. Other than that, is there anything y'all want to leave us with before we wrap up the interview here that
yeah,
maybe we
we do.
missed? Or yeah.
Well, we do have an event coming up. If somebody wants to get outside, we have Stride into Skokie. It's our 5K that will be September 21st, and there'll be info on that on our website. That we'd love for people to come join and walk, and they'll hear from a participant. They'll hear more about our work and be able to walk along a nice route and get to know us. So that'd be great.
Awesome. Anything, Vince, that you want to share with before we wrap up?
I think just going back to that story about what I heard on the radio. When you hear a story of someone and going through life, maybe when you encounter those things where your initial instinct is to say, well, what's wrong with you? Maybe
Yep.
rephrase it as, what happened to this person, and think of it a little bit more from their perspective and how you might be able to think of it differently and change their day in a positive way.
Well, Patty, Vince, thank you so much for sharing the story of Impact Behavioral Health Partners. We're really honored to share it. And people that are listening, go to all the links below and get engaged. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with Patty and Vince. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Joseph.
you.
Really appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.